to you from Jacksonville, Florida. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, Senior Consultant at Telus and GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're talking infrastructure and Vision Zero in Jersey City, New Jersey. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. Engaging Local Government Leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. And your membership helps support this podcast. So if you like GovLove, go become a member and tell us about how much you love GovLove. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Barkha Patel is the Director of Infrastructure for the city of Jersey City, New Jersey, a position she's been in since May of 2022, when it was created to oversee the planning, design, and implementation of the city's critical public infrastructure. Previously, she served as Deputy City Manager, Director of Transportation, and as a Transportation Planner for the city. She's also served as a lecturer for the Rutgers University School of Planning and Public Policy. With that, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I'm excited to nerd out about infrastructure and Vision Zero, but our tradition on the podcast is to do a lightning round first to let you warm up a little and let our listeners get to know you. So my first question for you is, what was the first concert that you went to?
I went to see Jack Johnson at Madison Square Garden, which is not really a venue that you would think of when you think Jack Johnson, but it was a great concert.
Yeah, I would expect more like an outdoor amphitheater for him, but that's a great first concert. That's awesome.
Yes.
Very jealous.
Yeah.
All right, my next linear question for you. What's the last movie you saw in theaters or stream?
Haven't been to the theaters in a while, so I streamed a movie. I'm kind of late to the game here. It's been out for a while, but I watched a movie, which is a Hindi movie called Aankhon Dekhi. It's available on Netflix. I highly recommend to anyone.
Okay, got to add it to the list. All right.
Yes.
Okay, my next linear question for you. What book are you currently reading?
I'm trying to read Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. I get very little time for pleasure reading these days, so I try to do a couple of pages every night.
Yeah, it's a way to wrap up the day.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really nice escape, like really complicated, flowery language and just a whole other world. So I'm enjoying it.
Awesome. Very cool.
Yeah.
All right, and then my last linear question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
Skydiving. Just kidding. Not really, though. I do enjoy skydiving. Just really anywhere where I can have a lot of quiet time, I find is best for me. I tend to need a lot of that, so it could be just a walk around my neighborhood. Anywhere in nature, anywhere near water is great.
Yeah. All right, so skydiving.
I really love skydiving. It's a really expensive hobby to have, but
How often does one go skydiving as a hobby?
I'm averaging about once a year for the past 4 or 5 years.
Nice. Okay.
Different locations every time. Yeah.
And so is this like the buddy system skydiving, or are you by yourself, floating in the air?
Yeah, I know, right? I'm working up to the point where I can just do it by myself. I think I need a lot of training for that. Yeah, it's the tandem one where you're hooked up to someone. And it's really funny because I always have a really different reaction when I jump out of the plane than most other people do, which is I just go completely quiet and don't make a sound and just enjoy floating in the sky, which always scares the person that I'm hooked up to. But I've always been fine every single time.
They're probably is she okay? What's going on?
Exactly. I gotta do all of the gestures to let them know I'm okay. I don't know. It's a really meditative experience. For me, I don't know why, but I really love it, and you just walk away with a really refreshed outlook on things, I think, from having that, vantage point and that experience.
That's awesome. Well, you're definitely the first GovLove guest that's brought up
really
skydiving as a place of relaxation and inspiration. So I love that.
Yeah.
Awesome. So another thing, I always like to ask guests is their path to local government, just because not everybody has the same path into this field, and there's lots of different ways and different types of work that we talk about on this podcast. So for you, what was, can you, I talked a little about your your bio at the beginning, but can you kind of from your perspective talk about what was your path in local government? How did you kind of end up in this position you're in today?
Yeah, I'm really curious to know the answers of other people you've had on the podcast, because I'm assuming um, not a lot of people sort of intended to be in the space, and the story is similar for me, which was that it was pretty haphazard actually. I studied sociology in school for my undergrad, and then on a whim I applied to the urban planning program. So that's what I have my master's degree in. Um, and I was always sort of fascinated with social problems, being a sociology major, and themes of, like justice and power dynamics in society and all of these things. And when I got to the point where, it was almost time to graduate and I had to think about jobs, I realized that that's not really something that will land me easily within a job or a career after college. And randomly I heard about an urban planning program through one of my classes, and I got into that. And so having a master's in urban planning and taking the social problem sociology lens into that work in my graduate program sort of put me on this path to think about how urban planning is practiced in the real world. And during the entire process, almost everyone told me not to get into local government or government at all. um, Vehemently so. I mean, professors in my grad program would just, advise students that after they graduated, they should really be aiming for these sort of prestigious, like planning firms and doing consultant work in the private sector. And government was really seen at that time as a place that seemed really cumbersome and didn't have a lot of upward mobility for people, and you don't get to work on exciting projects. So no one had advised me to go into this field, but I just noticed that during the 2 years of my graduate program, I was really fascinated with the city that I work for now, Jersey City, for a lot of reasons, but mostly because it's the place I had visited almost every single weekend while I was growing up in North Jersey. Um, it's one of the most diverse cities in the country, has been voted as such for many years. And it was sort of a landing place for a lot of immigrant groups, specifically Indian immigrants, which was my family's background. So I was just really fascinated with this place. And all of my projects seemed to center around Jersey City. And as someone doing my thesis program, getting ready to graduate from my urban planning master's program, I did a presentation to the planning department of Jersey City. And when I graduated and was looking for jobs, something opened up in the city. I immediately expressed my interest, and that's how I started working for the city. It was in transportation planning, which was not something I focused on necessarily, but I just loved the place so much and wanted to do whatever I could to work in that place that I admired for so long. So that's how I got in. And then the path to, the position I'm in now has been sort of a long and evolving one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And there's so many pieces of that I like resonate with me and my own career, and then kind of I think is I can't believe people are like don't go into local government for planning. That's
I know.
that's very interesting.
Yeah, well, I will say that I think we have, at least in the part of the country that I'm in, I think the work that we've been able to do in Jersey City specifically has really helped shift that dynamic.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are now looking to local government as the place where you can have the most influence and where the most exciting work is happening, and all of these innovations and people just sort of taking control of their destiny as a city. Is happening more so now than I remember being the case when I was studying in this program and when I was in grad school. And I think, we've definitely had a role to play in people thinking about those things differently. It started for me specifically in the transportation space and evolved into other things like, the Vision Zero work and parks and buildings and climate action, all kinds of things. But yeah, the shift has been really interesting to see. And I'll also say that as a child of immigrants, I'm Indian American. Public service is also just not the most, um, expected or
Hmm.
even accepted
Mhm.
path for a career. And that's for many reasons. It's a really, layered
Yeah,
conversation to
yeah,
have for immigrant families. But I will say that for many years, my family did not understand why I would ever want to do this work,
really.
for those same reasons, because it's not really viewed as a career choice that seems to have a lot of influence or prestige or like upward mobility opportunities, whether that's related to money or other
Mm-hmm.
things. And even that has really changed. And now my family just sees this as sort of like a new path that's been charted. And I get a lot of people in that community wanting to talk to me about how that happened because
Yeah.
it's just not common. You think like doctor, lawyer, engineer, that kind of thing.
Mm.
So I think that dynamic has really shifted.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Well, and I mean, I think it speaks to something we talk about on, IDLGO and GovLove is like telling local governments telling that story of like, this is the work we do, and this is the kind of people that get to work on those things, and like this
Right.
is the background they have, and like, because it's interesting, I'm a consultant now, and I used to work in local government, and you
Hmm.
miss the like actual implementation of those like big plans or or
Yeah.
studies or reports that you work on, and like that's exactly kind of I think what you're touching on is like the maybe the common guidance back then was you want to go work on these big flowery reports, but actually the rubber meeting the road is happening in the local governments, and you need people to do that work too. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And, I was actually going to ask you about that because I noticed that you had experience in various different cities and governments, and specifically with the budgets. And, there's this conversation we have a lot in this space about how the budget is what speaks to what the priorities are.
Mm-hmm.
Like where the
Mm-hmm.
money is going is indicating what's important. And that's been such a different sort of like environment that exists now in Jersey City in terms of the work that I'm doing. That wasn't the case when I first started. And to your point about just working on the plans, when I first started with the city, the job description for the position that I took on was very different than the work I actually ended up doing.
Yep.
It was supposed to be like a grants management position and a person who developed planning reports. And when I came into the position, I saw an opportunity when we had to do a planning study to take that and, like you're saying, sort of elevate the work into something that actually happens on the ground. It
Mm-hmm.
was around the time when I was thinking a lot about the kinds of firms and consultants that the city had done work with historically and how we can sort of breathe new life into that. Um, Tactical urbanism was a really big part of the conversation at that time. And I saw an opportunity to say, every time we do a transportation study, why don't we just test something on the ground as a part of that study to better inform the recommendations that come out of a year-long planning process? That is a really long time to go by from when you're making a commitment to a community that you're going to try to improve some aspect of the public realm. In this case, it
Mm-hmm.
was the pedestrian environment. So sidewalks, crosswalks, the general aesthetics and feel of the city for someone who was walking. And I just saw that the scope of the study was so massive, and it was a year-long time frame, and people have a lot of fatigue in trying to
Mm-hmm.
interact with government processes. So that was the first time we ever used this approach of tactical urbanism, which is basically the idea that you take something, some sort of intervention that you think will help improve something in the built environment. Let's say that's a crosswalk. You take the idea and you implement it on the ground in a really temporary, quick, and inexpensive way
Mm-hmm.
as a way of showing people what that would actually feel like, look like, be like in their real experience of that street. and you give them the opportunity to respond to you in real time and give actual feedback, as opposed to seeing something on a plan that's hard to interpret. You don't really understand all the aspects, and you don't know how it's actually going to impact you. And when we did that, we call them demonstration projects. We got so much engagement from residents all over the city. And more than the engagement, what we got was people telling us, we've been wanting you to do something for so long, and you haven't, and you're finally doing it, and we want more. So that's sort of the ideal problem to have, which is you have a captive audience, there's a lot of built-in demand, and really what's being asked of you as a government employee or a public official is do more of this and do it quickly. And at that time, we went all in on the transportation improvements, on the ped bike improvements, because Jersey City was a unique case where we have some of the highest percentages of transit ridership in the city. It's one of the most densely populated cities in the country after San Francisco and New York. And yet none of the transit systems were within the control of the city. So they were all external agencies. We had no control over them whatsoever. But what we did have control over was our street network. And so we were able to make pedestrian and bicycling safety improvements very quickly at a large scale and scope, and to be able to iterate on it very, very fast. And so that's exactly what we did. And that's what built up this sort of legacy of trying things, treating the city like a lab, not being afraid to make mistakes as long as you were always there to fix them and iterate.
Yeah. I love that. And I'm, we're going to talk more about kind of the city's Vision Zero work and your kind of department. But, I wanted to ask about the tactical urbanism piece because, there's something there that you said that was really, fascinating. It's you're shortening that feedback loop too, from residents saying they want an improvement, and instead of it taking like you said a year or more to like actually finish the plan and then implement it, you can go out and try it right away. And so now people are not only seeing improvements more quickly, but they're also seeing the result of their feedback being in the like real world, that's awesome. So I'm curious, how do you, can you talk maybe about how you guys actually, on the like day-to-day, like nitty gritty, like actually implement those, like how do you say this is something that we're going to try a tactical urbanism approach with? Are there outside groups doing those kind of things, or like how do you guys actually go from, we heard feedback on this intersection, let's try out some tactical urbanism, what are the things that we want to do?
Yeah, I think what's a little bit different about the way Jersey City approaches tactical urbanism, which is different than maybe other communities in the country around the world, is that a lot of the tactics, which is the actual action that's happening on the ground, is happening in a city-sanctioned way where we are approving it, enabling it to happen, as opposed to what the history of this work has been, which has been known by many names, things like DIY urbanism, guerrilla urbanism. And usually what that is when a community, out of, sort of frustration and dissatisfaction with a government not acting quickly enough, goes in and makes the changes that they want to see themselves. And sometimes they partner with the city, but sometimes they don't. And it's just delivering the message of like, this safety improvement cannot wait. We have to do it. And we're showing our urgency by us just doing it ourselves. In Jersey City, it's been different because we sort of preempted that. And from the beginning, we had always been the ones saying, let's try something new. Let's do something on the ground and just test it and see if it works. And the way that plays out day to day is that now we're at a point where all of those processes are very well institutionalized within the city government processes. So we'll get a request in my department through the traffic division, which is a part of my department, where someone will say, there's an unsafe intersection here, and I don't know why it's unsafe, but people are speeding. It's hard for me to cross the street. Please do something about this.
Yeah.
We will receive that and immediately evaluate it. And I have a very multidisciplinary team. So I have planners and transportation planners, traffic engineers, sustainability people. So they'll all look at it and say, we think that this is an intervention that will work here. And then once we identify what that is, they'll very quickly draw up a sketch of what that change will look like on the ground. And it's nothing fancy. It's not like a technical engineering plan or anything like that. It's just a conceptual idea. We will then either hand that over to our public works team in-house, or we will hand it over to one of our on-call contractors who are usually responsible for like striping work in the city, concrete work, fixing sidewalks, whatever else, whoever can do it the most, quickly and efficiently. And they will then go in immediately and implement that, and will, in the meantime, send out communication saying, this project is going to happen. This is the time period that it's going to be in existence. And this is the way for you to give us feedback. We will also be there on site so you can talk to us, in person. And so once that's implemented is when we start getting people saying either this is great, we want more of this, but fix X, Y, and Z element of what you've done. Or people will say, this is a disaster. We don't want any of this. Take it away. No one asked you for this. And we get a healthy amount of both. And then we take that back, and there's a lot of, sort of subjective like decision making that happens. We always try to tie it into overall goals that my department and the city has related to transportation, sustainability, etc. And then we will either iterate or remove the thing and try again, try a different intervention, whatever it is. And this is happening on basically a weekly basis, and has been happening for years. In the beginning, everything used to be done through our direction, through our consultant teams that we had for various different projects, because they just had the most flexibility to be able to act. Even simple things like procure the materials we would need to, paint a crosswalk or do whatever it was, because city processes tend to be really, very prescriptive and sometimes very slow. So we were leaning a lot on the firms that we had contracted with to carry out that work for us. Now we're at a point where most of it we're doing through our own teams in-house.
Very cool. That's awesome. So I'm excited to talk more about how that informs your cousin's Vision Zero work. But so I want to back up a little bit, because I think one of the cool things is like your role and kind of the I would say probably unique functions that are kind of under your kind of purview. So can you maybe talk a little bit about like the creation of the Department of Infrastructure, and then what are the pieces that are part of it?
Sure. I've had the great fortune of having multiple positions I've held while I've been in the city, be totally new positions that were created that didn't exist before I was in the role. So that's been great, and is obviously a really nice vote of confidence in me. So the Department of Infrastructure is a brand new department, although a lot of the functions that exist within it had been existing in a different way throughout city government for a while. So previously, our teams related to traffic engineering, engineering, architecture, parks, sustainability, innovation, those various teams had been within what we call the Department of Administration, which is kind of like a catch-all in Jersey City government that has, a number of different divisions within it. Over the last couple of years, as we reflected on the work that we had been doing and seeing how we had really scaled up the amount of projects that we were working on within the public realm, more so than ever before, it just made a lot of sense to centralize all of those functions under one department, to make sure that not only were we more public facing with all the work that we were doing, but that any work that was happening that affected the public realm would be aligned with everything else that was happening. So when I say public realm, for us, that means streets, transit, parks, municipal buildings, and then any public or civic spaces within the city are all under my purview with this department. And all of those divisions that go with it, which are architecture, engineering, traffic engineering, transportation, sustainability, innovation, are also all under me, and they are responsible for carrying out a lot of that work.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And just to confirm, it's not like the day-to-day maintenance or filling up potholes necessarily on those infrastructure, but kind of the planning and how does it all kind of interact with your transportation sustainability kind of goals, right?
Yeah, so a lot of that kind of work related to maintenance, when it's major work in terms of a complete overhaul of something like a streetscape project, or a building that's being completely renovated, or a park that's being completely redone, those things do fall under my department in
Yeah.
terms of the planning, the design, and the construction management of those
Mhm.
things. But more minor repairs and maintenance happen through another department, which is for us called the Department of Public Works.
Yeah,
And, they just obviously partner very closely with us to do a lot of this work, and they primarily handle that.
that's really cool. Okay,
Yeah.
that's awesome. So it's a new department and it's a new role for you. Like, but these functions existed before. How did
Yeah.
you kind of go about like saying this is how I want these formerly disparate functions to work together and be like and align their kind of work?
Yeah, I think really the most effective tool for aligning the work that's happening is um, for us to develop a strategic plan, which we're in the
Mm.
middle of right now. And really, the reason for that is that I found that because we've now created a new organization within city government,
Mhm.
even though we're saying that our goal is to streamline and to reduce barriers for people to engage with us, and make things easier for not only the residents of the city, but also elected officials, other city departments, etc. It can often feel like that anytime you're adding a new layer
Mm-hmm.
of any sort of entity within city government. And I noticed pretty quickly on that there was a need to have cohesion amongst all of the divisions, because we had gotten to the point where there were certain key people within each of the divisions that are under me who pretty much understood the big picture of what we were doing and why, and how what they were doing related to something that someone else is doing. But that wasn't the case for the rest of the staff. And it's really important to me to make sure that anyone who's working in my department, whether they're an intern or whether they're, online staff and just doing intake of resident feedback or whatever it is, or they're, licensed engineers, planners, architects, everyone has a basic understanding of why we're here, what's important, and what this team as a whole is doing. So I think the strategic plan that we're developing is really the way for us to um, accomplish that internally, and then to report it back out to the residents and to the public, to the elected officials, and say, here's our best shot at sort of distilling all of the things that we've been saying are important for all of these years, and us incorporating all of those things into the work that we will do over the next 5 years.
Mm.
So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that the role really requires me to fall back into sort of like a teaching role, which I'm enjoying.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, outside of citywide goals that we have, Vision Zero is one of them. Our climate action work is another example. There are a lot of things that are just deeply important to me that I've been trying to center in the conversation about infrastructure. And I'm seeing conversations happening nationally about things like the legacy of discrimination within
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure projects.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just important to me that we, in my department, recognize the existence of those things historically, and then use
Mm-hmm.
our positions of privilege, um, as decision makers for a lot of really really important work that's happening, to make sure that we're not perpetuating that, and if anything, we're reversing it, and identifying ways where we can be restorative in our practices to communities that have been marginalized. So an example of work that I've been doing recently, just internally, which people probably don't even know that we're working on, is I've had each of my division directors who are from a different discipline, which is a
Mm-hmm.
really great thing to have. I have a really multidisciplinary team to investigate their own professions that they're a part of for instances of, so this month we're tackling, because it's Black History Month, racism against the Black community specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And so to identify ways in which architecture or transportation planning or engineering, and those professions have been used as tools for discrimination in history, whether that's just in Jersey City or broadening the lens and in the country. And then I'm having them look at, examples of what anti-racist infrastructure, like in the actual physical realm, in the built environment, looks like. And then we're thinking about how we can use that information to inform the projects that we're working on, the decisions that we're making, how we're engaging with communities, and making sure they're adequately represented in our process. Sort of going through the exercise of taking concepts that can feel really, really big when you're just one person working in local government, and bringing them back down to uh, a level that's manageable and in a way where you feel like you can actually do the right thing in this space. And here's the ways that we can do that. So that's just another thing we're working on now, looking forward to thinking about what feminist infrastructure looks like in the future, the immigrant experience with infrastructure, things like that over the next few months.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, talk about a way that, I mean, that's such a interesting and a cool way to operationalize equity work, right? It's not just you're learning about it, but it's, hey, this is what we can do, especially in the built environment, to address past wrongs or try and try and beat against maybe historic injustices. That's really cool.
Yeah, I think especially because it can feel like when you're dealing, if you're just an everyday person, living in a city, interacting with the built environment, and then, or even going to a public meeting and hearing these professionals talk about the work they're doing, what the data are behind their decisions, it can feel intimidating in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it can feel like it's sort of beyond, um, you know, uh, not beyond criticism, but sort of feels like it's almost down to a science. Like, how can you uh, criticize an engineering process? How can you criticize a traffic study? Like, it's just numbers. How is discrimination infused into something that seems so objective?
Mm-hmm.
And this is just my way of sort of opening the door to the people who are on my team to take a really hard look at those things and recognize that there actually is a lot of bias in all of our professions and has been for a really long time. And the fact that it doesn't feel like there would be is an indication that something is wrong. And so it's our responsibility to make sure we uncover a lot of those things for the end result of being able to be more transparent with the people who we are working for, and helping them feel like it's not just about, them, us going to them at strategic points within a process because we need to win approval in order to do a project. It's really about tackling these bigger issues as much as it is, making little progress every day, doing the next right thing every day, and sort of celebrating the wins whenever we have them.
Yeah, well said. Awesome. So I think that's kind of a good way to get into probably your Vision Zero work. So,
Yeah.
And we'll link to this in kind of the show notes for this episode. But you guys were recently, the city was recently profiled in Bloomberg around kind of your work around Vision Zero and reducing traffic fatalities. I don't know the best way to start, but like, can you maybe talk about the history of kind of the city's approach to Vision Zero, and maybe the adoption of that strategy, and then we'll get into kind of the nitty gritty of like what you guys have done.
Sure. So in 2018, the city committed to our Vision Zero goal, which was setting a goal to eliminate all traffic-related fatalities and severe injuries on city streets by the year 2026. It was a really ambitious goal at the time. We were the first city in the state of New Jersey to adopt a Vision Zero policy and to sort of make a commitment to this goal. And I have to say that really what led to it was a concerted effort by the advocacy groups in Jersey City who had been working for years and years and years on traffic safety specifically, who were seeing little bits and pieces of some of that work I mentioned earlier, where we were trying things out on the streets and trying to improve intersections and make things safer, and saying, we need to aim higher. It is not acceptable that anyone should die on our streets as a result of just trying to get from point A to point B. And this is something that the city needs to take really seriously. And at that time, the mayor, who's the current mayor of Jersey City, Stephen Fulop, made that commitment and by executive order directed multiple departments within the city to figure out a plan to achieve that goal. I had a pretty central role in getting to that commitment, that executive order, and then developing the plan that came afterwards, which serves as our action plan. And helps guide all of the work that we do specifically related to traffic safety. And obviously it wasn't just me. We had a really strong city manager who was, who cared very deeply about this work and still does. And professional staff on my team who I worked closely with to get to that point. And at the time that we committed to the goal, we were averaging about 9 fatalities in the city per year. And that was the average over a decade of data that were analyzed specifically related to traffic crashes. And, the numbers were really interesting because we saw that there were more fatalities happening on the streets that were controlled by the county and the state, and there were more severe injuries happening at that time on streets that were controlled by the city. So in Jersey City, we have a number of sort of like arterial roadways that are higher capacity, multiple lanes that run through our city that are owned by the county that we're a part of. And then we have a couple of roadways that are extensions of highways that run through our city, which are controlled by the state. And so committing to a Vision Zero goal when many of our streets that were some of the most dangerous weren't in our control was a really difficult task. And the way we worked around that was we created an action plan, looked at 10 years worth of data, and identified what we call high injury streets. So any city in the country that has a Vision Zero action plan you will see this map and you will see something called a high injury network. And what that is a collection of streets in any given city, which is usually a minority of the overall street network, that's responsible for the majority of the high injury crashes that are happening. We're not unique in having something like that. Essentially, every city that has done this work has identified, and people who are listening will know within your own communities what the dangerous feeling streets are. It's usually that one. So for us, we identified several miles of roadway within our 218-mile roadway network that were contributing to a majority of the fatalities that were happening and severe injury crashes that were happening. And we took that information and essentially created an action plan with 77 different strategies that were multidisciplinary across 15 different agencies within the city. And it would be actions that we would take every year until the year 2026 to accomplish that goal. And so that's exactly what we had been doing. And the focus of those actions really was primarily doing engineering and design work to completely redesign those roadways to prioritize the most vulnerable users on our streets, which are people on foot, people on bikes, people who use transit.
Hmm.
And so what happened after that action plan, and even while the action plan was being developed, was that we were undergoing a massive redesign stage of many of the major corridors within the city. And we've seen great success with a lot of them. So it looked like taking roadways that had multiple lanes, putting them through what's called a road diet, where you essentially consolidate the lanes on a roadway and then win back space that you can then reallocate for things like transit lanes, bike lanes, more sidewalk space for pedestrians, outdoor dining, whatever it may be. And what we found is that for so many of those streets that we've redesigned, which used to experience these fatal and severe injury crashes, are no longer seeing that happen. And those numbers are speaking for themselves. And I think that's been I think that has led to the successful year we had last year, which was that on city streets specifically, we did not have any fatalities. We did have a few on county and state roadways, and we did have severe injuries on various streets. And so that's just, the continuation of the work and what we will be focusing on for the future.
That's really cool. So it's fascinating to hear that there's kind of this, again, interdisciplinary approach. Maybe give an example of like an intersection where you found out this is a problem spot, and like what that interdisciplinary approach led to, kind of in terms of a solution, and then kind of how that got implemented.
Yeah, sure. So we had an intersection of a local street that was just, one lane in each direction, and then sort of a high capacity corridor that had multiple lanes in each direction intersecting. And we had seen multiple fatalities happen at that intersection. It felt like basically a sea of asphalt because there was just so much open space. And it experienced a lot of the common issues that you see on streets in a city, where cars are parking too close to the crosswalk, and so it makes pedestrians not as visible as they should be. The lighting wasn't great. Speeds were really high. People were sort of zooming around the corners and making turns at a really high speed, and exposing pedestrians and bicyclists to that sort of aggressive behavior. And so what we ended up doing at that intersection, which was slated for a massive reconstruction a couple of years down the line through a grant that we had achieved, we said, obviously this work can't wait for 2-3 years, maybe, if the grant funding ever comes through and we get authorized to do the work. So we implemented what's called a painted curb extension, or a bump out. And the great thing about this was that we partnered with other agencies who are part of our Vision Zero work, like our communications team and cultural affairs, even our health team and city planning. And what they helped us see was that this was in a part of the city that had a really rich culture for local artists, who we as a city are trying to elevate and incorporate public art into our infrastructure projects. And so we were able to take residents who were impacted by this dangerous intersection, who had skills that they could offer to the city through their art, develop artwork to paint in that curb extension. So instead of it just being a boring bump out, it became a lively, colorful art installation. And it was near a school, so the artist sketched out what the design was going to be, and then we had students from that school volunteer to actually paint it on the ground. And so really the best thing about a project like that is not so much what the end result is. I think it's the number of people who you're impacting and whose experience you're sort of tapping into by doing that. Because now the artist will be invested in that space being kept clear and looking beautiful for as long as possible. So when there are issues and it needs to be maintained or whatever it is, they will proactively reach out to us, and the city can do something about it to fix that issue. The students are going to go home and tell their families about this great work they did, and their families are probably people who are walking on that street, who are driving on that street, who will then be more mindful in terms of their own behavior as they're navigating that space. It's art and it's beautiful. It's colors in the roadway. So there's already this psychological traffic calming that happens, which is broadly written about and spoken about by, a lot of experts. So it's really just tapping into so many different spaces within government and within the communities and the residents. And we try to accomplish that as much as we can across our projects.
Yeah, wow, that's so cool. And I think this probably gets at some of your kind of approach with tactical urbanism, where I think most cities would have said, "Hey, we're planning to remodel this, this intersection anyway. We'll take care of the safety aspect in a couple of years when that grant comes through."
Yeah.
But instead, you guys are taking that more tactical approach and being like, "Let's at least try something that can make it that can improve safety more quickly," and then adding that flavor of art, like that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these, when you talk to someone who's not, a government person,
Yeah.
just seems like a really common sense thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you have this grant for many millions of dollars and it's going to take many years to implement. And they will probably say to you, okay, but things will probably change by then. So how are you going to account for that? And when we say, yeah, that's a great point. That's why we're testing this thing out now in a temporary, lower cost way. We're going to monitor it and see how it goes so that by the time we do get that money, we are as prepared as we can ever be. And we've tested things out and done sort of like a proof of concept. And so we can also be better informed in the way we're designing that street in the future or that building or that park, so that we can make the best use of the money that's coming to us and the time that we have in between. Like, people really respond to that and they feel like, okay, I can trust you to make the important decisions about, taxpayer dollars or about the services you're delivering to me or whatever it is, because that is an approach that just seems reasonable, transparent, efficient, smart, whatever word you want to use. And I think that's been the key to people being able to engage in our processes is if they're not volunteering or if they're not, intimately involved in actually what's happening on the ground, they're just more aware of the fact that this is the way we're doing things and they seem to resonate with it. Obviously, it's not perfect.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of room for improvement. I will be the first one to say that in all of our projects, and we're always trying to do better, but it just seems like a better thing to be nimble and flexible within city government wherever you can, because there are so many places where you absolutely cannot.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, that being iterative makes you guys better at your jobs down the line too, because you can learn what does actually work. Well, we thought this might help, but it turns out this other strategy had a bigger impact. So it has that twofold where you're helping residents see the impact quicker, and engaging them in the process, which is so cool. And then also improving your guys' kind of day-to-day effectiveness and ability to kind of do your job.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. That's so cool.
Thank you.
So, I'm curious. You mentioned, there are some county and state roads in the city, and those are very dangerous. And you guys are not alone in that. And there's lots of places, around the country that have to deal with the same kind of dynamic where, it might be a main street that's 4 lanes when it should be much more walkable and more approachable for kind of the needs of the city. But I'm curious, how are you guys kind of working with the county and the state around those streets? Are you trying to improve safety there too, since those are kind of your most dangerous places, or what's kind of the approach there?
Yeah, a couple of different ways. I think our primary way of doing that is just through advocacy. We try to be, really organized in our advocacy on county and state projects. We try to keep a finger on the pulse whenever things are happening, and sort of make our position known and heard in a public way whenever possible, just so residents can see sort of what the city's position is on things that are happening and what we would recommend. We also have been working on developing much stronger relationships with the people who are working within the county and state governments. Because that's just a different level, that's just a different kind of connection, I think, that can yield much more positive results sometimes than the, like sending a letter in
Yeah.
my official capacity kind of thing, which can be off-putting. Everyone's a person and they just want to have a conversation. We're in similar environments. I think that's always really key, is to just try to connect in that way, and try to get to a solution that's a win-win-win for everyone involved. So it's a lot of advocacy, and I would say it's a lot of, again, taking on the responsibility of proving concepts that the county and state government may not have the flexibility to test with, to test or experiment with. So that for us has looked like, implementing a lot of bike infrastructure that's very new and being done for the very first time in our state in a lot of ways. And it's happening in a way that sort of, I have to choose my words very carefully here, kind of like defies what the federal guidance may be. For simple things like, for the longest time, it wasn't allowed to paint bike lanes green. And the justification behind it was whatever it was. And so anyway, we had been doing a lot of things, and when enough time had gone by and there were movers and shakers within county and state government who were sort of observing what we were doing, seeing that nothing catastrophic had happened because we had painted a bike lane green, that then allowed them to do their own advocacy to the federal government, to get, waivers for things like that and allow us to do things that just made sense. So I think they're also trying to do their best for the most part. And whenever we have the ability to test something out that may be uncommon for them, we do that. And then we try to hand that over to them as a proof of concept and say, we did this, here were the conditions, here's what worked, here's what didn't work. We recommend that you do this on this street, which impacts us. And you can point to us as the example. And so, we very gladly serve as the guinea pig sometimes on these projects, because we see that as the way of sort of reducing the resistance and just getting to the end product that we all want to see. Sometimes it's much more difficult. Like, we, like many other communities, are in the middle of a state decision to widen a highway that will impact the Jersey City community. We've been very vocal about our opposition to that, and we've tried to work with the state officials, advocacy groups within city government in a lot of ways to always be leading with sort of that clarity and conviction of like, this is categorically not a thing that should be happening. And so whenever we have the influence, we try to use it for good when we see that something will be really harmful that a state or county entity is trying to advance.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about being the guinea pig, it's also leading. You can also say it's leading by example, right? Like you're showing like, hey, this can work, or this, we thought this would work, and it turns out this part didn't, that part didn't, and that can help them. Like that's a really interesting and cool way to approach this. Where you're providing, again, sharing those best practices,
right?
And that's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're, especially a state entity is using reference guides that to inform their policy that, often are outdated or often are written for a completely different context. A lot of these standards and things are written for more rural communities, and that's not applicable to a highly urbanized, extremely densely populated community like ours. And so we have a couple of options in that case. We can, write them all the emails and letters and whatever else that we want saying this isn't applicable to us, like you cannot apply this, or we can use the limited amount of resources instead of doing that to then just again try something out in the real world, in the built environment, and then let that speak for itself. And that also enables the advocates within our community, the residents, to point to something and say, we are your stakeholders the same way
Yeah.
we're the city government stakeholders, and they've done this, so you can do that too.
Yeah, yeah, well said. Yeah, yeah, yeah. To your point, like their rules don't apply in inside cities, especially big ones that want to be
Right.
that have different goals with those roads than they do
Yeah.
when they're outside of cities. That's all. This has been a fascinating conversation. So, I think you might have touched on this already, but is there anything you wanted to add around the kind of internal processes you guys have for coming up with projects and kind of within the city for Vision Zero?
Yeah, for Vision Zero at this point, we're just at a stage where we are trying to harden a lot of the projects that we had implemented in a more temporary way. And a lot of us say this pretty often, which is that we've made a lot of progress in this space over the last few years, but progress can be really fragile. And while it's great that we can accomplish a really impactful project with just paint, it also means it's really easy to reverse when it's just paint. So right now we are all hands on deck trying to identify funding and look for ways, take advantage of opportunities wherever we can upgrade that infrastructure to look and feel and be more permanent. And sort of organically, we've also had a lot of our transportation work spill over into the placemaking space, which is something that I was really intentional about when I was transitioning between roles. And it just made a lot of sense because you can apply the same sort of tactical approach to public spaces and parks and activating areas that residents want to gather in the same way you do with transportation projects. And for us, that was really important because Jersey City, the parks that are in the city's jurisdiction in Jersey City are very, very small. And so that means they have to be everything to everyone. And, I've been working on ways to try to integrate the transportation work with parks and sustainability and climate action and innovation, because really what we're doing is innovating the way the city builds and activates public spaces that can look and feel urban, but that are still instilling nature back into the city, which has been really important to us. So I'm constantly just looking for ways where I can try to weave together all of the different divisions that are under me to work on projects that all make sense. And the Year of Open Space was one of them, which was exactly that. Coming out of the pandemic, we realized that park space is not just a nice to have luxury, it's a necessity for communities all over the world. And because parks now have to be so many things and work so hard to meet all of the varying needs of people, how should we be thinking of them differently? How should we be building them differently? How do we move on parks projects more quickly than typically is the case, which is just like transportation, these projects tend to take years and years and years, millions of dollars. So we've gotten to a point where we're using the same tactical urbanism approach for public spaces and parks, crowdsourcing, recommendations, testing them out on the ground in a really light touch, low cost way, and then investing in those improvements once we've sort of vetted them and made sure that we're all okay with them. And what that has resulted in is really reclaiming a lot of space that you normally wouldn't think of and turning that into a public space. Like I've been able to advance a lot of pavement to parks projects in Jersey City, which is a community where, like I keep saying, it's very densely populated, it's highly urbanized. There isn't really a lot of just like blank canvas land that's available to turn into a park. So you have to get really creative. And so we've had a portion of a street that we've pedestrianized and turned into a plaza. We've had a portion of the street that we've turned into a full-on park, like with grass,
Wow.
playground, everything. We've had, strange sort of intricate intersections within our street network because it's a historic city, so it isn't really a traditional orthogonal grid. We have a lot of different grids clashing with each other and forming these really strange triangle intersections and things that we've reclaimed and turned into parks. We're taking, historic town squares and turning them back into plazas like they used to be. And then always infusing all of that work with the cultural identities of the people who are surrounding that area, whether that's currently with all of the immigrant, populations we have throughout the city, or whether that's paying homage to land that was historically occupied by native tribes and bringing in design elements that, that call back to that. An example is within our green infrastructure, having biodiversity from the time, back then that we know these are native plants to this area, or having custom sort of street furniture or different elements within a public space that call back to the country that an immigrant population may be from, like the Philippines or Italy or India. So those are sort of the things that we're working on right now, and we hope that all of those things are felt when the projects are actually implemented on the ground.
That's so cool. I'm glad you took yourself to the Year of Open Space, because that's I wanted to be sure to ask you about that. And that's such a cool initiative. So we'll be sure to kind of link. I think you have some more information about it on your website too. So we'll link to that in the show notes. That's such a cool initiative.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, we've talked for so long, and I feel like there's so much more I wanted to ask you about. But
I know,
you'll have to come back.
Yeah, I would love that. I feel like we could talk for a really long time.
Yeah, this has been awesome. So this is one of our hardest questions. So to kind of wrap us up, our traditional last question on Govlove is: if you could be the Govlove DJ, what song would you pick as the X music for this episode?
You know what would be really great if you guys had one of those like DJ name generators that are just random words.
I love that.
Yeah, I think that would help me really
get in the zone.
Get in the zone. Yeah. So I was gonna say Queen, "Don't Stop Me Now," but as I'm reflecting, I think "Imagine" by John Lennon is more apt.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Perfect.
You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I know I'm not the only one. And I'm sure a lot of the other government leaders who are part of this organization can relate. So I'll go with Imagine.
Definitely. That's a great pick. Well, Barkha, thank you so much for coming on top of me and sharing your expertise and your experience and all the cool work going on in Jersey City. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. This was great. I really appreciate you having me.
Cool. And for our listeners, Govlove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders. And the best way to support Govlove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/Govlove or on Twitter at the handle @GovlovePodcast. And subscribe to Govlove on your favorite podcast app. And go tell a friend or colleague about this podcast. Help us spread the word that Govlove is the go-to place for local government stories. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been Govlove, a podcast about local government.
Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too.